You bet. Let's get rid of that. Uh, so this Tolstoy talk I have done before. I did it 10 years ago, it turns out, here and at first. But you know what? Tolstoy is so amazing and his quotes are brilliant. So I think even if you've heard it before, just listening to Tolstoy again is good. Don't listen to my bit, but listen to Tolstoy's bit. So I first encountered Tolstoy through the BBC. They did Anna Karenina, lots of, Russian soap opera, suppressed passion, costumes, big leather shoes and riding crops and all sorts of fur and things. But to be honest, I actually preferred Pride and Prejudice and Jane Eyre myself. And it wasn't until much later that I actually discovered that he's got a whole set of other writings, religious and moral teachings, that are really interesting to us as Unitarians. Tolstoy, it turns out, was a leading figure in the Christian anarchist movement. He championed the whole notion of non-resistance to evil. He was a social critic who wrote on a vast array of subjects, and he was a lead figure in a religious movement that shares some similarities with Unitarianism. His key was that he made a distinction between religious institutions and religious beliefs. He decried all the abuses of churches and argued that instead individuals really would do best to follow the prime rule: love others as you would be loved. That's his starting point. And with that, he then talked about speaking out against violence, wars, armies, patriotism, the class system, and oppression of any kind. I chose Gandhi for a reason, and that's because Tolstoy's message was a key influence on this young lawyer in South Africa, and to others in the entire nonviolence movement. So, Tolstoy, Count Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, was born in 1828 into an aristocratic Russian family. They owned land, they owned serfs. His mother died when he was 2, and then his father died when he was 9. And then he lived with his aunt, and she died when he was 13. And then he went on and lived with another aunt. So as a psychologist listening to that story, I would be immediately thinking attachment issues, multiple loss issues, and I would be not too surprised to see in later life issues with mood, relationship problems, etc. So that's my take on that childhood. His youth has been described as dissolute. He had lots of relationships with peasant girls on the estate, lots of liaisons, venereal disease, and a troubled relationship with schooling. He entered university intending to study Oriental languages, then changed to law, and resisted applying himself and ended up dropping out. But he was a reader, and he read widely throughout his life and then wrote extensively in his journals. Drifted for a while, developed gambling debts, so he joined the army and was immediately sent to Sevastopol during the Crimean War. And what he saw there really had an influence on him, and of course affected his writing with War and Peace. And then after the military, he traveled throughout Europe. While he was in France, he witnessed a public guillotining, and that also had a profound effect on him. He kept writing throughout all of this. He wrote his novels, and he was well received and well received into the Russian literary circles. In 1862, he married Sophia. She was the daughter of a friend. She was 16 years younger than him. And in the meantime, he'd also inherited estates from his mother. And he began spending time there on the estate with the family. And it seemed that the marriage started well. They had 13 children, but became a relationship of conflict over time, mainly because actually he was switching from these very popular books to his moral philosophy. And he was making lifestyle changes throughout that. So if you look at the context, at the time, the serfs had been given some limited freedoms, but the suppression of them was brutal, very brutal in Russia. Lots of people advocating for change, revolution, all of this going on. And one of the things that was pointed out to me after I did the last one, that the last service, was that Tolstoy really picked up on just what was being suppressed and the anger and sort of inherent violence there. And so he feared revolution and the potential for even more violence. He didn't like the brutality either. So hence his development of his moral teaching and the non-resistance to evil. He became very ascetic. He gave away lots of his goods, and people started to follow him. A religion grew up around Tolstoy. His wife was not one of his followers. She didn't approve. She had 13 children to raise, and she was really pragmatic. So they had this conflict. In the end, Tolstoy actually left the estate and actually died shortly afterwards at a rest stop. Very outspoken about religion, obviously raised in the Russian Orthodox Church. He then left it, ended up being excommunicated in 1901. And he also went into a deep depression. When he emerged from that depression, he came out of it with a definite belief. A belief in God, but not in church. He was promoting then instead a personal religion. What he had done was very much what Thomas Jefferson had done. He went through the Testament, the New Testament, and took out all the bits that were around it and went just to the teachings of Jesus. So he stripped away everything else and found at the core of Jesus, the message that was in the Testament is to love others as you would be loved. And that was his key point. And everything came from that. So he didn't see Jesus as a divine figure, but he promoted that message. And he said, the fulfillment of this teaching consists only in walking in the chosen way, in getting nearer to inward perfection in the imitation of Christ, and outward perfection in the establishment of the kingdom of God. And indeed, he titled one of his books, The Kingdom of God is Within You. What he was saying is that this message, do unto others as you would have them do unto you doesn't require miracles. And in fact, miracles and rituals get in the way. The key is the message itself. And to him, it was self-evident, and it was in harmony with nature. He also believed that religious institutions are co-opted by people who want power and then pervert the religious message to help them maintain their power. And that's very much what Christianity has done, and with the priests, etc., according to him, takes away from the message of Jesus, and the throwing everybody out of the temple, what he did there in the temple to get rid of the priests is key to Tolstoy. Because he believes that the institutions themselves, when they pervert the message, use the message of infallibility to support their power. He also didn't like the use of the church to encourage young men to join the army. And he viewed the army just as the opportunity for men to murder men. So what he was focusing here is the discrepancy between the message of the church and the tools that the church uses, by suppressing questions, by encouraging others not to answer the questions, using the power of the church, using solemnity and ritual to overawe people so that they do not question, by saying one thing and doing another. He stated that the church creed and all the trappings are inconsistent with the teachings. And he said this over and over in his books. And so what he was promoting was not following priests, not worshiping in a church, but having a personal religion that does not require the intercession of the church. He said you can either follow Jesus or you can follow church. You cannot do both. And it wasn't just the Russian Orthodox Church he condemned. He condemned all of them. He made specific mention to the Salvation Army for some reason, the Roman Catholic Church, the various Protestant churches. He saw them all as pseudo-religion, and that's a quote, because they're justifying slavery, justifying oppression, justifying violence. And he was very amused that each church claims to be the one true church. How can they each be true? Was his argument. His work is great for quote mining. I love it. What he said about the Bible. Is there in Christendom a book that has done more harm to mankind than this terrible book? Referring to the cruelties in the Bible. And then he said, biblical stories are the inculcation of nonsensical beliefs for children in order to deprive them of the capacity to think clearly. It's just great. But he didn't even spare science. Science, he said, was a collection of haphazard, disconnected scraps of knowledge, many of them quite useless. What I love, though, the part I just think he's amazing, is what he has said about the class system. He describes 4 techniques that governments and the power elite use to maintain their position. The first is intimidation, using the argument that the state is sacred and thus any attempt to change it must be dealt with by cruel punishment. The second is corruption, because officials and middlemen benefit from the system and that so they're motivated to maintain it. The third is through hypnosis, And what he meant by that is using educational and religious teaching to brainwash children into unthinking obedience and to encourage religious and patriotic superstitions, banning books and allowing the use of alcohol and tobacco to stultify the population. The fourth is by using military training to brutalize a portion of the population so that they will carry out acts of violence, separating them, dressing them in special clothes, using drums and cries to hypnotize them. Profound. The things he says, just amazing. He also argues that we're all participating in this class system. And I'm quoting again here. People who stand on the lowest ring of the ladder, partly as a result of being stupefied by patriotic and pseudo-religious education, and partly for the sake of personal advantages, cede their freedom and sense of human dignity at the bidding of those who stand above them and offer them material advantages. He said that those at the top of the ladder are so perverted and stupefied by the power of life and death which they hold over their fellow men, and by the consequent civility and flattery of those that surround them, that without ceasing to do evil, they feel quite assured that they are the benefactors to the human race, and that they use the flattery of their clergy to sanctify and bless their way of life. Here's the best quote of all about the class system. The apex of the core is seized by those who are more cunning, audacious, and unscrupulous than the rest, or happen to be the heir of someone who was. He saw the armies as supporting this system and believed that people should refuse to serve in them. He also spoke out against patriotism, which he said was an unnatural, irrational, and harmful feeling, and a cause of great part of the ills from which mankind is suffering. It's used to obtain power for one group at the expense of others, and it's promoted because it's in the advantages of many classes to maintain the government through the use of patriotism. He promoted instead the brotherhood of man. He's very prophetic here, and he warned way in advance of the revolution that attempts to gain freedom from violence by forcibly overthrowing the government were likely to lead to another authority which would be as oppressive, if not more so, because of the intensified hatred that a revolution would bring. And look what happened. With war, he spoke of the the terrible weapons of destruction that were being invented. And our best guess, I think Peter at the time, we thought was the Gatling gun. He predicted that they would not bring an end to war, these weapons of destruction, but would instead lead to men being slaughtered, quote, by thousands, by millions. And he warned that they may tear themselves to pieces and still they will march to war like senseless cattle. He said that in 1893, well before World War I. What he was promoting was the message of non-resistance of evil. This was his basic premise. If we love one another, then we cannot do evil or violence to anyone. And he was insistent that this means no matter what. Even in a situation where somebody who's innocent will die if we don't murder the evil murderer, he said we shouldn't do it. There is no situation, according to him, in which we should resist evil with violence. It's very clear. Instead, we should love one another. that this is God's will, and that improved behavior would follow from those feelings of love. Increasing those feelings, he said, was the meaning of life. Change does not come from revolution, but from truly religious people promoting love. Rather than worrying about other people, he said we should focus on our own moral development. And thus a religion sprung up around him, the Tolstoyans. He didn't choose to be their guru, but they chose to follow him. They were conscientious objectors. They lived communally. They were vegetarians. They practiced abstinence from alcohol and tobacco. There were up to 6,000 of them, and they were persecuted by the Bolsheviks. Similar to the Doukhobors, and what's interesting there, Tolstoy had a lot of sympathy for them. When they were persecuted in Russia, he intervened with the Tsar and obtained permission for them to emigrate to Canada and helped to pay their way along with the Tolstoyans and the Quakers. Gandhi, very influenced by this after reading The Kingdom of God is Within You in South Africa. He described it as one of the 3 most significant influences in his thinking, and that it convinced him to abandon violence and espouse nonviolent resistance. They wrote to each other a lot, and Gandhi referred to Tolstoy as the greatest apostle of non-violence that the present age has produced. And also, Tolstoy had an influence actually on the community at Swantula. Diane Lineker told me about that. They read Tolstoy a lot in Swantula, and it was a key inspiration for the founders of that community. All right. So what does this mean for us as Unitarians? I think there's a lot we can take away from Tolstoy. Clearly, his message is about war, the way that countries interact, the way that militaries indoctrinate so that soldiers can kill. I also hear Tolstoy now whenever a politician promotes patriotism. It's one thing to feel luck and appreciation for being in Canada. It's another to have unthinking, unquestioning promotion of Canada at the expense of all other countries. We would be, if we were following Tolstoy, we would be thinking along global lines, not narrow nations. Some would argue that Tolstoy is too passive. Gandhi took it one step further and was more active with nonviolent resistance, whereas Tolstoy is very passive. And he's promoting that ascetic life. Certainly, if we look at Martin Luther King and others, there's an effort to take action while still using nonviolence. So we can maybe adapt some of Tolstoy's message. We can certainly, I think, identify with Tolstoy's depiction of the hypocrisy of organized religions, creed-based religions. I think Unitarianism tends to avoid many of the criticisms. I think our focus is back on personal conscience rather than being told what to do. For most of us, it's more a community where we can share with people. I think there's a message, though, still for us when we get caught up in being overly Unitarian, or if we overly identify with our church, or we find ourselves saying, as Unitarians, we should, which I think is code for you should do what I think is right. And Tolstoy would tell us to listen to that and just to get back to the essential message. We can also watch for becoming too hierarchical, for charismatic leaders who may at some point use the church for their own power. maybe we should be careful about moving from being a community to being an institution. I think Tolstoy would like our principles. I think he would be a little bit suspicious of our rituals. He'd want to make sure that they don't take a life of their own and lose the message. His main message, love others, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Key, isn't it? And so important right now as we enter into a time of tribal divide with vaccination status and masks, etc. How do we deal with conflict among groups? Even how do we deal with conflict within groups, including our own? Do we reach out with curiosity to try to understand the point of view of others? How do we try to embrace differences with love? We're always trying to balance out, setting our boundaries and protecting ourselves, but is it possible that we can do so while still staying open to the other? With that in mind, if we work to do that and take in Tolstoy's message, then dealing with conflict is the spiritual practice that we've heard about in previous services from Michelle Brown and Restorative Justice Victoria. Not easy, but something that we could strive towards. And finally, I'll just have a message about Tolstoy and accessibility. War and Peace. No, couldn't get through it. It's very long, lots of Russian names. There are actually 580 characters in it. Sorry, I didn't finish it. However, you know what? His religious and moral writing, much more accessible. I enjoyed reading that. The kingdom of God is within us. That's where he talks about resistance, non-resistance to evil. It's straightforward to read. There's occasional references to things we don't know about, but otherwise it's not bad. It's also super accessible in terms of cost, because all of this material now is out of copyright and is available on Project Gutenberg for free. And some of it's on audiobooks through LibriVox.org. Tolstoy would love this. And the reason I say this is that in 1891, he renounced copyright to all of his books published after that date. Bit of an issue with his wife, but she liked the money coming in. But he believed in accessible knowledge. So it's free, it's out there. I would encourage you to take a look for yourself. Thank you very much.
Sara, thank you very much.